Hey folks, it's Mr. G. Welcome back to the channel. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be discussing some of the differences between the wet sump oiling system that you're going to find in my 2002 Z06 and compare it to the dry sump oiling system that you're going to find in the 2009 ZR-1. So for those of you who are returning, thank you very much. Nice to see you again. For those of you it's your first time here, please subscribe. There's plenty more to come. Hey folks, this is Mr. G and welcome to Just Corvette Crazy. On this channel we talk about Corvettes, we fix some Corvettes, and we love to drive our Corvettes. So if you like what you see, hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out a lot. Thanks. Thanks for sticking around, everybody. So what we're going to be doing is spending a little bit of time just talking about what's the difference between a wet system and a dry system, and then we're going to look at a couple of the benefits of each. So what I've got here is some amazing artwork, and this represents a typical engine. So we've got our valve covers, heads, block, oil pan, intake system. All in all, this looks an awful lot like E.T. For those of you who are too young to remember, E.T. was a movie that came out in 1982. It was a story about a little girl named Gertie and her brother Elliot, who discovered a stranded alien was living in their shed. And then the whole movie, they try and get the alien back home again. So for those of you who have never seen it, it is a great, great family movie. Again, E.T., the extraterrestrial. Watch it with your kids. Great movie. Anyway, here is our engine. Looks a little bit like E.T. In a wet system, the oil that circulates the engine is all contained within the engine. So in the oil pan, we have filled up with our oil. What happens in a wet system is that there's an oil pump, and the oil pump is normally located on an LS engine. It's actually on the front of the crank. And the oil pump has a siphon, and the siphon actually comes down and into the oil pan and into the oil. As the engine spins, the pump sucks the oil out of the oil pan and brings it up to the top of the engine, and then gravity actually feeds it back down through the engine back into the pan. So the oil comes from the pan, brought to the pump, so it's pumped to the top of the engine, and then it actually feeds its way back down through all of the engine components back into the pan. It's called a wet system because the oil pan is completely full of oil. So it's wet. So the bottom of the engine is always wet with oil. So now let's compare that to a dry system. So same style of engine, but the big difference is the oil pan is very, very shallow. So the oil pan is very shallow in a dry system. The oil is no longer contained inside the engine, but it's contained in a storage container external from the engine. We have a pump. Normally, the pump is belt driven. pump is more than one pump in one single unit. So basically, we've got pumps whose job it is to suck the oil out of the bottom of the engine and put it into the can, so the storage container. Another part of the pumps got a job to pump the oil out of the container and into the engine. So again, under pressure, it puts the oil to the top of the engine, and then it feeds its way through back down to the shallow pan. As soon as it hits the shallow pan, the oil is pumped back up into the can. So we have an external pump. It contains more than one pumping unit. Sometimes it contains 2 or 3 separate pumping units just to bring the oil out of the engine. And then it has a return pump that pumps the oil from the can back into the engine. This is called a dry system because the oil is not stored at the bottom of the engine. So the bottom of the engine is dry. As the oil hits that pan, it's immediately sucked back into the can. And then it circulates that way. So, dry system, shallow pan, no oil is contained in that pan. The oil is actually contained up in the can or the storage device. Alright, so now we're just going to go through some of the benefits of each system. The big benefit for the wet system, because everything is contained inside the engine, the pump, the siphon, the pan, the oil, it is very easy to mass produce and manufacture this system. This is why this system is being used in the majority of vehicles around the world even till today. So in this particular system, everything is self-contained, so when you're assembling the engine, there are no external components to the oiling system. Everything is self-contained. Very easy to mass produce. One of the downsides to the wet system is when you are looking at a high-performance vehicle. High-performance vehicle going into a tight corner is going to pull a lot of G-force. What happens in a wet system? If you looked at the oil in the pan, so I'm just going to draw another pan here, and I've got oil in the pan, and I've got the pickup. As long as the pickup, so the end of that siphon, as long as that pickup is in the oil, it will bring oil up and deposit it or pump it into the top of the engine and have the oil feed back down. But what happens when you apply large G-forces in a corner to liquid? Basically what happens, it's like you're turning the motor on its side like that as you go through. So the forces are actually throwing the oil to one side. So what happens is we end up with oil to one side as you're going around a curve. we run the risk of the siphon not picking up oil. So in that corner, as we're booting around that corner at high speeds and high Gs and the oil sloshes to one side, there is a possibility that the siphon will not be inside the oil anymore. Therefore, you're going to starve your engine of oil. So for the length of time that you're in this long, tight turn, your engine is being deprived of its oil. Then when the engine comes back and we're straightened out again, going down the straightaways, we're back. So let's compare that now to a dry sump oiling system. So with the dry sump oiling system, we don't have the deep tank or the deep pan. We've got an oil storage container in a pressurized system. Oil is being pumped into the tank all the time. Oil is taken from the tank and into the engine. So with this system, it doesn't matter if we hit some high Gs and the system goes up like this. Since this oil tank is pretty much always full, we've always got plenty of oil to pick up and feed the engine. So this system does not have the oil starvation that the wet system does under high loads or high G-force. It's a big benefit of this dry system. There is another benefit of a dry sump oiling system, and that is increased horsepower. If you take the same engine and you put a wet sump oiling system on it and then swap it out for a dry sump oiling system, you will get an increase in horsepower. On a typical 400 horsepower engine, you might see a horsepower gain of 20 horsepower. This is how it works. If I have my cylinder walls, and inside the cylinder I've got my piston, the way an engine works is as the piston comes up, it actually compresses the air on the top. So this is upping the head. Compression happens, a spark, an explosion, and then the piston is driven downwards. In a wet sump system, when that piston is being driven downwards, so the piston is being driven into the engine, the amount of space inside the engine is contained in itself. So that means that when the piston is driven down, it's actually fighting against compressing the air inside the engine. So having a tank of oil sitting at the bottom of the engine, when these forces are being pressed into the engine from the piston coming down, it's actually compressing the air inside the engine. So that actually puts an extra load on the piston going down. It's now fighting these forces of compressing the air inside the engine. That limits the horsepower, robs the system of power, because some of this downward force is being used up to compress the air underneath the piston. This is because this is a closed system and the volume in here is fixed. If we now move to a dry system, with a dry system, we have a pump that pumps the oil out of the bottom of the engine. So there's always this siphoning, low pressure that is taking the oil out. Think of it as a vacuum cleaner. It's always sucking the oil out of the bottom of the engine so that the engine pan remains dry. So there's always this suctioning happening. So think of it like this. There's always suctioning forces at the bottom of the piston, sucking that oil away. So it is no longer a sealed area here underneath the pistons where we're compressing the air. The air and the oil are always being sucked out like a vacuum cleaner. So therefore, down in the lower part of the engine, we have a much lower pressure than we have at the top of the engine. And we have a much lower pressure than what we would have in the wet system. So therefore, when the piston is driven down, it does not come up against the forces that are compressing the air. It's actually helped by the suctioning of the pump removing the oil from the bottom of the pan. Another interesting benefit is when we look at our piston rings. Because we are siphoning out the oil from underneath, and this becomes a low pressure area, and this is a high pressure area, we actually have a better ring seal. So the high pressure on top of the piston versus the low pressure below the piston actually seals our rings against the cylinder walls better than it would if we had high pressure, high pressure. So we get a better seal, we get more vacuum, if you will, at the bottom of the cylinder. So therefore, less buildup of pressure, less forces to overcome, and we can see an increase in horsepower. Now to wrap that all up, increase in horsepower. So when the horsepower goes up, it translates into a lower ET. Again, great movie. Watch it with your families. Well, I hope this helps. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And until next time, Mr. G says, keep the rubber side down, everybody. Take care.